When Rayhana Khan arrived in Jeddah International Airport, she removed her shoes and told her daughter to remove her shoes too because they were standing in a holy ground. Then Rayhana knelt down on her knees and kissed the sacred sand with her lips. She took some dust in her hands, sprinkled it on her daughter's head, and blessed her. After that, she took some more dust and rubbed it on her head, and blessed herself. Then she hugged her daughter and said to her, "We have reached the holy land of Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Here lies the holy house of Allah and the shrine of Muhammad, our blessed Prophet." Rayhana was not a religious woman, but that day she felt as if she was on a pilgrimage to the most holy of holies. She thought that she and her daughter had fulfilled the dream of every Muslim in the world by visiting the city of the Prophet Muhammad and circling 7 times around the Black House of Allah in Mecca city. Rayhana expected that as soon as she entered the holy city she would see the holy men and women of Allah filling the streets in pilgrim garb and money would be scattered on the streets like garbage filled the streets of Bombay. Everything around her looked so beautiful and clean. She could not believe her eyes when she looked everywhere without seeing one piece of garbage or one destitute child. Rayhana could not see cigarette butts beneath her feet or walls of spit lined with red stains of tobacco pan. Rayhana's eyes could not spot one single beggar. In Bombay, beggars could be found everywhere. They are as numerous as flies hovering over garbage containers or mosquitoes in gutters and swamps. While they were walking inside the arrival area, Rayhana felt as if she was walking on a street of glass shining like the sun. She could see the reflection of her image in the glassy white marble from which the floor was made. While she was walking, her head was turning in all directions. She wanted to see everything because she had never before seen such an amazing sight. Rayhana's innocent heart was overflowing with joy. Her joy suddenly was clouded with sorrow when she remembered the only man that she had ever loved. She wished that her lover was walking right beside her and holding her hand. The memory of Jamal Khan turned her face to her little daughter who was walking by her side and looking very happy. She bent down and gave her daughter a kiss on her cheek and whispered in her ear, "Allah has blessed the people of His holy city because they are good and worship Him only." Rayhana made a quick contrast between the misery and poverty of the people of India and the happiness and richness of the people of the holy city that she had come to abide for the next 2 years. The contrast led her to believe that Allah cursed the people of India because they were evil idol worshippers and the people of the holy city were blessed by Allah because they were good and worshipped the only true God. She also thought that she and her family were living in utter poverty and misery in that filthy and hellish slum because they were not following or worshipping their Allah properly. When she came to that realization, Rayhana decided as soon as she reached the house of her sponsor she would begin to pray 5 times a day and she would never allow any man to touch her body if he wasn't her husband. She even asked her Allah to forgive her for allowing her lover to touch her body and kiss her lips. She blamed herself for doing great harm by allowing Jamal, who wasn't her lawful husband, to touch areas of her body and fondle her breasts. While she was still walking on that glassy passage, Rayhana repented for her terrible sins that she committed with her lover and made a vow to her Allah that she would never ever repeat the haram again. She asked her Allah to grant her great success while she was living in His holy city and after 2 years unite her in a lawful marriage relationship with her Muslim lover, Jamal Khan. Then, and only then, she can do halal sex with the man of her dreams. Unfortunately, things did not go well with Rayhana and her daughter upon arriving at the first airport security checkpoint. When they were asked by the airport security to show their passports, they said they did not have them. The security official repeated his question 10 times, thinking the dumb Indian woman did not understand what he was saying. He was talking to Rayhana through an Indian interpreter. Each time Rayhana gave him the same answer and each time he did not believe her. He refused to believe that 2 passengers could possibly fly from India to Saudi Arabia without passports. Finally, he became fed up and contacted the flight crew of the Saudi plane that brought Rayhana and her daughter from Bombay. He was shocked when he discovered that the 2 Indian passengers had entered the plane without their passports. Since the aircraft was a Saudi plane, this was considered by him to be a terrible infraction. He informed his senior officer and asked him what to do with the 2 Indian passengers who had arrived in the country without passports. Without asking why or how the passengers arrived without their passports, the senior officer gave the order for the 2 passengers to be returned as soon as possible on the next flight back to India. Now the 2 questions before the Saudi airport official were which plane should take them back and who was going to pay for their return tickets. Both passengers arrived with one-way tickets. When every concerned party refused to shoulder the responsibility of deporting the 2 illegal Indian immigrants, the police placed Rehana and her daughter under arrest and arranged for their transfer to the Jeddah's Women's Central Jail. While these phone conversations were taking place, Rehana and her daughter were placed in a small police lockup at the airport. They spent many hours in that small lockup. They had no knowledge of what was going on regarding the discussions for their transfer back to India. They received free meals and felt grateful to enjoy such delicious Arab food. On the evening of the day of their arrival, 2 Saudi policemen came and took them out of the airport lockup. They handcuffed Rehana's hands but left her daughter's hands free. Only when she was handcuffed did Rehana understand that she was in trouble. She asked the 2 police officers why they were arresting her, but she did not get an answer because none of them could understand Hindi. The 2 Saudi policemen could only speak Arabic. Then Rehana tried to show them their visas, but they just ignored her papers and took them inside their police car and drove away. While the police car was building up speed and traveling through the busy streets of Jeddah, Rehana was looking at the people who were walking on the pavement. The first sight that caught her attention was the 2 kinds of human creatures that were walking along the streets. She recognized the men from their white clothes and their long beards. During the 3 weeks of her honeymoon in downtown Bombay, she saw many of Koleba's foreign visitors were dressed up in that fashion. She even recollected that her kind Saudi sponsor wore the same strange clothing. The long jalbab that each man wore appeared to her to be like a woman's nightgown. She could see the men's private parts through the slightly transparent clothing. The other kind of human creatures she saw were women. If human society wasn't made up of men and women, she wouldn't have known that those fully concealed creatures were human beings. Each woman was fully covered from head to foot by a black burqa. For Rehana, those women looked like ghosts. She was worried that her sponsor might force her to put that black bag over her head. She was scared that if he made her wrap up like that, she might not be able to breathe and die a slow death. Rehana ignored the human beings and began to take in the view of the beautiful tall buildings. She was surprised when she did not see any shacks, slums, shawls, or any other type of poverty-stricken habitats. Once again, she reminded herself that Allah had blessed the people of His holy city because they were so righteous and worshipped Him from their hearts. After a long drive, Rehana could no longer see human beings or buildings. She could not see any tree or mountain. Wherever she looked, she saw the empty sands of the desert wasteland. Rehana thought that if she were in the hands of the Bombay police in India in such a deserted and empty place, they would rape and kill her. She remembered how the Indian police had beaten and abused her in jail. She thanked her Allah that she was arrested by Muslim police officers. She thought that she and her daughter were safe in the hands of these most righteous city policemen who feared the Most High, Allah. When her eyes could not find anything else to see, Rehana began to doze off and finally she fell asleep. While she was sleeping inside the police car, she began to snore. She was so tired and exhausted from her long trip from Bombay to the holy city, and the long time she spent in that small police lockup. Her daughter had fallen asleep as soon as the police car left the airport and entered the city. Rehana's sleep was interrupted when a rough hand shook her head and woke her up. She found one of the 2 policemen sitting so close to her. She was very scared when she discovered that a man was sitting so close to her until his body was touching hers. She tried to move away from him, but she couldn't because she was hemmed in by the car door and his body. She spoke to him in Hindi and told him to move away from her. The policeman did not pay any attention to what she was saying and began to touch her body. She began to tremble and her her body was stunned by fright. It took her a few seconds to overcome her fear and shock. The Saudi policeman moved his hand from Rayhana's shoulder and took hold of one of her breasts. Rayhana decided to act fast and push him away. However, she could not use her hands because they were handcuffed behind her back. The policeman caught her by the chin and forcefully began to kiss her on the lips. Rayhana struggled violently to release her lips from his mouth. She managed to free her mouth for a few seconds before he overpowered her again. She butted him with her forehead and even bit his lips. The policeman released her lips and began to squeeze her breasts, and his other hand slid down quickly to her private parts. Then he tried to pull down her salwar. Rayhana did everything she could to prevent him from undressing her. While she was struggling to free herself from the policeman who was trying to rape her, Rayhana suddenly heard her daughter began to cry and call to her mother for help. Rayhana turned her face and looked out of the car. She could not believe her eyes when she saw the second policeman was holding her daughter's hand and trying to make her touch his penis. He was half naked. His trousers and underwear were rolled down. He was standing out of the car with his penis standing fully exposed and erect before her 7-year-old daughter. The policeman managed to make the little girl to hold his penis. Then, he tried to make Ifat insert his penis in her mouth and suck it for him. At first Rayhana thought she was still asleep and having a nightmare. The never-ending groping of her assailant and her daughter's screams bellowing hauntingly in her ears made her senses believe that what she was seeing was more than real. When her senses realized the impact of what she was seeing, Rayhana became furious and began to use her feet to kick violently at the policeman who was molesting her inside the car. The shock of seeing a grown man trying to rape her little daughter was more than she could bear, and she fought with all her might to try and save her. The policeman meanwhile was trying to subdue Rayhana in every way he could. He hit her in the face several times and tried to close her mouth with his hands, but he couldn't. Every part of her body was moving and pushing him away from her. If her hands weren't handcuffed behind her back, she would have strangled him to death and rescued her child. When he could see she was going to be hard to control, he shouted at his colleague and informed him that the Indian woman might kill him if he did not let go of her daughter. He knew that when the Indian woman heard her daughter crying and saw what his colleague was trying to do to her little girl, she became extremely angry and aggressive and difficult to control. Nevertheless, the other policeman did not respond to the words of his colleague and continued with his evil act upon the child. He began to hug the little child and rub his penis on her body while trying to kiss her mouth. Rayhana began to scream and cry out loudly and showered the evil policeman with all bad words she knew. The policeman ignored her outpouring of insults, which he didn't understand anyway. Rayhana knew she could not stop these evil men from raping her and abusing her daughter. She decided to give up her resistance and allow the men to rape her alone and spare her child. She used her body language to signal to the policeman who was trying to rape her to ask his friend to stop touching her daughter and come inside the car and do whatever he wanted to her. The policeman understood her body language and got out of the car and caught hold of his colleague and told him what the Indian woman wanted and agreed for them to do. The evil man was not willing to release the small child until his colleague pulled the child from him by force. The evil policeman was angry as a wild beast whose easy prey was just snatched away from him. His game was over and he could no longer play this wicked vile act he was enjoying so much. Therefore, he ran like a leopard in leaps and bounds to the car in his hunt for another victim. He caught hold of one of Rayhana's legs and pulled her out of the car. When Rayhana was out of the car, he stripped off his remaining clothes. He then straddled Rayhana's body as she surrendered like a lamb to the slaughter and he began to rape her. The other policeman joined him and the two evil men began having sex with Rayhana both at the same time. One raped her from the front and other sodomized her from behind. It was as if these men beast had never touched a woman before. While they were raping her, they were biting and hitting her viciously and violently. Rayhana, screaming while trying to silence her pain, endured their violent and sadistic rampage motivated by love for her child. She knew that if she resisted or tried to stop them, they would leave her and go for her defenseless child. Little Ifrit saw everything from the moment the two evil men of the holy city of Allah stripped her mother naked and ripped off her clothes. She saw when they began raping her as she stood by herself crying and begging the men to stop and leave her mother alone. She screamed and begged on her knees, "Please stop! Please stop! Leave my mother alone, you're hurting her." She did everything she could to ask them to stop, but they continued. She watched with eyes clouded in tears, and yet her pleadings went unanswered. There was nothing she could do to help her mother. The two Saudi police officers violently raped Rayhana Khan until she lost consciousness and hovered between life and death. The wicked Arab men were not satisfied in leaving her unconscious body undisturbed, but they continued to rape her lifeless body. Each one of them raped her 3 times and sodomized her. Finally, they got into their vehicle and drove away, leaving her for dead. They neither bothered to put her clothes back on or cover her naked body. They did not care about her crying child. They expected both mother and daughter would eventually die in the hot desert and their bodies would be buried by the shifting winds of sand. After they left, little Ifrit went over to her mother and covered her mother's private parts with the dress that was ripped from her body. She tried to awaken her mother thinking she was asleep. She shook her mother's body vigorously and called to her to please wake up, but her mother did not respond. Ifrit remembered that her father had killed himself, so she had some idea about death. She began to think the police officers had killed her mother while they were beating her and doing those terrible things to her. She had seen everything they had done to her mother, but she did not understand what they were doing or why they were removing all her clothes or what her mother had done to make them angry with her. After they left, she believed her mother was dead and she stood up and began to wail loudly with a strong outcry. The place was a desolate area located far away from the city. It was on a deserted road where cars very rarely passed by. It was evening and the sun was setting. It started to get dark and Ifrit became terribly frightened. She had no idea of what to do and she was afraid to leave her dead mother to go in search of help. Ifrit sat beside her mother where she cried and cried until she lost her voice. Finally, she fell asleep upon her mother's body. It started to turn cold within a couple of hours after the sun went down. The chill shook Rayhana from out of her long deadened state of unconsciousness. She forced herself awake. She was in horrific pain radiating from every part of her body. She then remembered what had happened to her and she moved quietly so as not to wake up her daughter. She moved her daughter's head slowly from her lap and strained to get up on her knees. She tried to stand but she could not. She discovered she was naked except for the single piece of clothing draped across her. She dragged her sore and aching body across the sand and began to collect her clothing piece by piece.